Hey, thanks for tuning in. In this video, we're going to be talking about the issue of leaven. We're going to be talking about the definitions of the words chametz and seor, and we're going to be talking about issues regarding leaven, both in historical sense and in modern sense, and we're going to be talking about the commands about the Feast of Unleavened. So first off, in talking about the events of the Exodus and the time of the Exodus and how the Israelites were living at the time, obviously they probably weren't going to go down to the store and buy one of these little packets of yeast and use that to make their yeast bread. Packaged foods, modern packaged foods like this, and modern food production, obviously does not exactly correlate to what went on back in the day. But what exactly was it that they were probably doing? What is it that they were doing to make leavened bread? And really, it's just a very simple process. It's something that you can try at home if you want to, assuming it's not the Feast of Unleavened, of course. But all it amounts to is you take a bowl, you take some flour and take some water, mix it together into a dough, and then just let it sit out. And you can cover it with some kind of coarse cloth or something along those lines to keep debris and insects out, but to allow air in. And then just wait. After a period of time, the dough will become inoculated, assuming temperature is right, assuming other factors are okay. The dough will become inoculated by a wild yeast. There are yeasts that are present in the air. Of course, there are also probably yeasts present in the water and in the flour as well. But the yeasts in the air come in and they begin to grow within the dough, and certain cultures end up dominating and they end up inoculating the rest of the dough. And that's how we get a leavened dough. At that point, you have a yeast culture. Now, we could, of course, take this dough at this point and just throw it in the oven and we'd have a yeast bread. The thing is, that's probably not what they did, because we would have to be continually catching wild yeast and have to be doing that process every time that we wanted to make bread. And of course, it would be very time consuming. And what they probably did was they took that bowl and they took their kneading bowl with the yeast cultured dough in it, and they probably added more dough, add more flour and add more water to it, mix it up, and then just allow it to sit. Now, it'll take a shorter period of time because we've already got the dough cultured with the yeast at this point. And so the yeast will spread out through the rest of it. And then, once it's to a desirable level, all we have to do is separate out part of the dough, the part that we want to cook with, and leave a small amount in the kneading bowl for later. And then we can add a little more flour, a little more water to it to make sure it stays active. And then the next day, if we want to make more bread the next day, all we have to do is just add more water, add more flour, mix it together, let it be inoculated, and then once again set some of it aside, use the rest of it to cook with. And so we would have a yeast culture constantly active and be able to be used whenever we wanted to. We wouldn't be buying packets of yeast or anything like that, obviously. We would be just using the culture that we had. And so once we've caught this one desirable culture, we can keep using it, because the fact is that we're using these wild yeasts. We may get something that's not so desirable in it, and we may not want to use that. But if we catch one that we like, we can preserve it. We can continue using it throughout the rest of the year until the Feast of Unleavened. And of course, we could also share it with our friends and family as well, and so they could use it. Now let's also talk about the issue of beer. Beer is very similar. It's made in a very similar way to a yeast bread. Essentially, it's the same process. We're just talking about a different ratio of water to the grains. And essentially, you take the grains and the water, you have a more liquid product mixed together. And of course, you could malt the grains or do something else with them to make the starches more accessible. And then add the yeast. You could either catch a wild yeast the same way that we were catching it with this dough, Or we could introduce some other yeast that was already caught, including possibly the skins off of grapes. Grapes have wild yeasts on their skin naturally, and this is one reason why they're so conducive to being used for winemaking. And we could be using the skins of the grapes both in making the beer, or we could be doing it with making the dough as well. We could be introducing the yeast from the skins of the grapes into the dough and use that as the yeast for the dough as well. So beer is very much leavened in a very similar way to dough, and this will be possibly relevant as we continue. Now, one other issue that I wanted to mention is the issue of vinegar. And this will become apparent as to why I'm discussing it later. But essentially, vinegar goes through a very similar process as well. Vinegar, of course, starts with an alcoholic beverage, alcoholic liquid such as wine or beer or some kind of strong drink. And the ethanol in the liquid is fermented by a particular type of bacteria. And that turns the ethanol into the acetic acid, the vinegar. And this in some ways is basically identical to the process otherwise, the process of leavening something. The only thing is that it's not actually a yeast per se, it's actually a different microorganism, but the process is very much similar. Now let's talk about some of the specific terminology used in the Hebrew and talk about some English terminology as well, just for clarification. First off, I think we need to be careful about using the term yeast. The term yeast has very particular scientific connotations in English, and the word yeast is not the word that's used in the law. The law is not written in English, obviously. We are just using English to talk about the law. And so I encourage us to not get very focused on the exact meaning of the word yeast. There are a lot of different microorganisms that do a very similar process that aren't considered yeast technically according to current scientific classification. But I encourage us not to get too concerned with that because the word yeast in its exact definition is not exactly relevant to what the law actually says. In the law, we're going to be talking about two words, Chametz and seor. Chametz is a word that's usually translated as leaven. Sometimes it's translated as leavened bread. In general, we're talking about things that are leavened. Now, the exact definition of leaven we will be continuing to discuss, but essentially, frequently it refers to leavened bread. But it also is used in Numbers to talk about vinegar. There it actually uses the word chometz, which it has different vowel pointing, but it's the same consonants. I want to point out that the vowel pointing in the law, the vowel pointing in the Torah, is not original. The vowel pointing was added later. It was added by later scribes and the Masoretes. It is not necessarily original to the text. And so this distinction between chametz and chometz may merely be a byproduct of the Masoretes trying to make a distinction arbitrarily. It may not actually be a distinction that's present in the original text, and this is something to be aware of. And as I mentioned, vinegar comes about in a very similar way to the process of leavening dough or leavening beer. It is just simply, it's a different microorganism and it's taking the ethanol and producing acetic acid instead of taking the starches and the sugars from the grains and turning that into ethanol, carbon dioxide, etc. Now at this time I would point out that the fact that we're talking about wine becoming leavened would seem to imply that wine in general is not considered leavened. And of course we can look at the tabernacle. The practice of offering wine is something that continues to be done during the Feast of Unleavened. It would seem to me that if that was a problem, if that was indeed supposed to be considered leavened, if wine was considered leavened inherently, that therefore it would not be done during that time. But instead it is, And once again, in Numbers, it's talking about wine becoming leavened. Wine turning into vinegar seems to be the process of leavening when we're talking about wine. So once again, it seems that the exact definition of the English word for yeast is not exactly what we're talking about in reference to chametz, because, as we can see, it does not seem that wine itself, even though it was made through fermentation of yeast, is considered chametz. Now let's also talk about the Hebrew word seor. Seor is translated as yeast or leaven in various ways at various times, depending upon your translation. But literally, it seems to mean remainder. It comes from the verb that's used to refer to remain. So for example, when it talks about in the plagues of the Exodus, the plague of the frogs, it talks about in the river they will remain. It uses the word that's spelled the same way, the verb form of seor. And I would argue that therefore the literal interpretation of the word seor is remainder. And I would point back to the process that we talked about earlier, gathering up the part that you're going to cook with and leaving the remainder in there for later. I think that this is probably talking about that very thing, that seor is referring to that remainder, that dough that is the continuation of the yeast culture. Now, this is just my hypothesis, but I think you can see that it does make sense. So now that we've defined some terms, let's begin drawing our attention toward specific passages in the law, the specific commands regarding the Feast of Unleavened, regarding chametz and seor. First, let's look at Exodus 12:15. 7 days you shall eat unleavens. Yea, in the first day you shall cause to cease seor from your houses, that all of one eating chametz, and the vitality, the she, shall be cut from Israel, from the first day unto the 7th day. So in this verse we can see two things going on. In regard to chametz, we are not supposed to be eating chametz from the first day to the 7th day of the Feast of Unleavened. So chametz is off limits to be eaten. We are not supposed to eat chametz. And also it says that we are supposed to cause to cease seor from our houses. Now if we interpret that as being the remainder, as being the cultured yeast dough, causing to cease it, presumably we would be throwing it out. We would not be continuing to culture that, or we would not be taking a remainder from a dough that we would be preparing before the feast. We would just be cooking the last of the dough and not causing to leave any for later. Let's also look at Exodus 12:19. 7 days seor shall not be found in your houses, that all of one eating caused to leaven, that's derived from the word chametz, and the vitality, the she, shall be cut from congregation of Israel, in sojourner and in native of the land. Continuing into verse 20, you shall not eat all caused to leaven in all your seats. You shall eat unleavens. So once again, we can see that there are two things being told to us there regarding seor and regarding chametz. It says that we are not supposed to have seor found in our houses. And also it says that we are not supposed to eat that which is caused to leaven. And this word is derived from chametz, is derived from the verb for chametz, so things which are being leavened. Now let's also look at Exodus 13. Exodus 13:7 reads, unleavens shall be eaten 7 of the days, and chametz shall not be seen to you, and seor shall not be seen to you in all of your border. So during the Feast of Unleavened, we are not supposed to have chametz or seor in our border, in our property. We are not supposed to have those things. And so presumably we would be getting rid of them prior to the feast. Now, of course, in terms of what went on for them personally at the time, it was probably a pretty simple procedure. It was probably pretty simple. They either just used up their yeast-cultured dough before the feast started, or they just threw it away. And that was probably all there was to it. And of course, any leftover leavened bread would have been either eaten or thrown away as well. And so, pretty simple process, not much to it, very simple and very easy. The thing is that nowadays, we're dealing with processed foods, we're dealing with a completely different way of making food oftentimes. And so that adds a few complications to the issue. Now, it can be easy to look at things now and think, well, I don't think that's what God intended. And it can be especially easy to think that if we think that the process of dealing with all these processed foods that have yeast in them or that have leavened grains in them, for example, if we think that to be particularly inconvenient, or maybe we perceive it as being impossible for us or impractical, that can just serve to reinforce the, well, I don't think that's what was intended, because the other interpretation is not appealing to us. So we need to be careful about that. And indeed, for some people, it will be definitely stepping out of the norm to become aware of some of these issues and to actually address them. And so I wanted to talk about a lot of different processed foods and things that this may be relevant for. If we take the understanding of Chametz as referring to leavened grains, for example, or leavened grain products, then this could have some significant implications regarding many processed foods. And I'm going to list these to bring them to your awareness so that you can look into it on your own and make your own conclusions. I would advise that we be cautious and that we don't be presumptuous just because it's convenient to be. So I advise that we take some time to consider this. This is one reason why I'm putting the video out now rather than right before the feast. So first off, enriched flour. Enriched flour, of course, has the good stuff from the grain taken away, and instead, sometimes they add back in vitamins that are made from yeast products. So they'll take grains and ferment them using yeast, and then they will extract vitamins from that and then put them back into the flour. This is one possible example. The issue of beer. We already talked about beer. Beer is basically produced the same way as making a leavened dough. It just has a different proportion of grain to water. Of course, the beer that is produced commercially, by the time we get it, it has been through most of the fermentation that it's going to go through, and it's been drawn off of the grains, but it definitely could still be a concern. Vinegar. We already talked a little bit about chametz, and we talked about vinegar. Vinegar usually nowadays is not made using wine or alcohol produced from fruit. Oftentimes it's made from alcohol that's produced from grains. And so we'll take, essentially taking distilled alcohol made from wheat or corn are two examples that I've seen, and then process that using the acetic acid bacteria. Another issue may be modern wine. Now, we already talked about how wine seems to be okay based upon the standards of the law, but the thing is that wine is not actually produced that way, oftentimes using the actual yeast off of the grape. Most of the time nowadays, it uses a yeast that has been cultured, and that culture has been maintained. Sometimes they're produced using yeasts that are being cultured on grains. And so effectively we're introducing the same sort of thing with the yeast loaf, the yeast cultured dough that we were talking about before. That is effectively being introduced into the grape juice. Soy sauce. Soy sauce is essentially fermented grains once again, and is just in liquid form. It's very similar to beer. It's just using different bacteria, different microorganisms. Very similar process, similar to both the making of beer, the making of dough with yeast in it, and also the making of vinegar. So could be relevant. Packets of active dry yeast. We already talked about this a little bit, but this is not, of course, just isolated yeast. It's not just yeast in those packets. The yeast is being cultured on grains before it is put into the packets. And so we're probably going to end up with yeasts and grains. Essentially, we're going to end up with the yeast culture like we were working with before, just in different proportions of grain and water. Once again, in this case, we're talking about a dried yeast culture. Many types of vitamins, including B vitamins, oftentimes are derived from yeast. And so they will be fermenting grains or something similar, and then they will be extracting vitamins from the yeast. We already talked about that with enriched flour, but this also includes vitamin tablets and vitamin pills, and also other things that are fortified with vitamins. And also not just B vitamins, but also talking about vitamin C as well. Vitamin C is oftentimes citric acid or made from ascorbic acid. We might look at that and think citric acid, citric fruit, but as I've talked about before, the vast majority of citric acid is not made from fruit. The vast majority of it is made from fermented grains. And so this is something to be aware of as well. And by the way, some of these vitamins, they're not necessarily made from fermentation via yeast, but as we've already talked about, that may not be the distinction that's being made in the law. The scientific distinction of yeast from other types of microorganisms, that is possibly just an English distinction. It's not necessarily a distinction in the Hebrew or in the law. So something to be aware of. Animal feed. This includes, of course, pet food as well as livestock food like poultry food. Most of these are essentially leavened bread. A lot of them amount to grain byproducts that have been made into kind of a leavened bread. Because yeast is so cheap and it's a good source of protein and vitamins, a lot of times they will just add yeast or yeast extracts or fermented grain products into livestock feed, pet feed, etc., in order to fortify it further. And of course, this potentially could be a concern as well. Even though it has meat and vegetables and whatever else in it, hypothetically, we are still dealing with effectively what is leavened bread in many cases. So it's something to be aware of, even if it doesn't say yeast on the label. Also, natural flavors. Certainly not all natural flavors are going to be made this way, but some of them might be. So something else to be aware of. Corn starch and other starches. Oftentimes, and you can look this up, oftentimes cornstarch simply amounts to corn being processed in such a way that it is fermented and then it is ground and separated into the starch. You can check this out. Obviously, that's probably an issue, and cornstarch is used as an initial starting point for a lot of different products such as corn syrup, and also, of course, high fructose corn syrup possibly, and dextrose, which is sometimes made from corn, cornstarch, corn sugar, other things like that as well. And of course, cheese is also could be interpreted as being a byproduct of leavening of milk. I'm not really sure if that is relevant or not, but it, I think, is worthy of mention, worthy of consideration. And also, of course, there are some fermented bean products as well. This may or may not be relevant once again, but a lot of coffee, for example, is fermented. Not all of it, but a lot of it is. And cocoa beans are processed with first being fermented. And also a lot of gums. I don't necessarily mean chewing gum, but gum like xanthan gum, carob bean gum. A lot of these gums are effectively fermented beans before they process them into the gum. So those may or may not be relevant as well. So I bring up all of these issues in order to raise awareness, in order to give us time to consider them and decide, what is it that Chametz really means? What is it in terms of the application today? Obviously, applying the command today is going to be different than applying it back in the day. And we can certainly look at things and say, well, I don't think this is what God intended now. But we could also say that I don't think that the way the food industry is set up today is what God intended necessarily either. And so we need to be careful about how we approach this issue. I think it does deserve caution. Certainly the command is worded very strongly, so to speak. And you can feel free to review that wording again on your own. But I think that we should be aware of these things. There are a lot of things that contain ingredients which are effectively leavened grains or yeast products that are being put into our food. And while the food itself may not be a leavened bread, one could argue that in many cases it has that in it as a component. So something to be aware of, something to take into consideration. So thanks for watching. Feel free to check out my other videos and make sure that you stay in touch. I will be continuing to put out more videos about the Passover, about the Feast of Unleavened, and about related issues over the coming days. So enjoy your feast. Thanks for watching. Remember the commands. Peace.